I'm Daniel Veksler, and I'm here to help you understand Russia better and without bias. In the couple of years leading up to the 1941 invasion of the Soviet Union by much of Europe under the leadership of Nazi Germany, the propaganda spread by Hitler's regime throughout the European continent, and oft repeated in the United States, claimed that the Soviet Union was preparing to attack Europe and spread communism throughout the land. Despite the fact that in the previous 40 years, Russia had lost its fleet to Japan, had undergone 3 revolutions that involved the loss of much of its military command, a 5-year civil war with millions of casualties, and devastating involvement in World War I, the world seemed to believe that the Soviet Union was in a position to be interested in things like world domination. Adolf Hitler and his Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, explained to the Western world that a preemptive invasion of the USSR was necessary, and the Western world largely ate this up. And let's leave aside for now the subject of where the Third Reich got the funding for its miraculous restoration from the dregs of ruin after World War I and the Great Depression. The Nazis were really good at keeping records of their own activities, including their unprecedented crimes. In fact, it was their own documentary efforts that led to the conviction and death sentences of Nazi leaders at Nuremberg in 1946. According to an overwhelming amount of evidence left behind by the Third Reich, the objective of Nazi Germany in invading the Soviet Union was total annihilation of the country, a leveling of the cities, and the enslavement and destruction of the native population. 6 months before the invasion of the USSR, one Nazi high commander wrote, "In Russia, all cities and cultural sites, including the Kremlin, are to be razed to the ground. Russia is to be reduced to the level of a nation of peasants, from which there is no return." In other words, under the ideology of manifest destiny, Nazi Europe was planning to implement the same policies in the Soviet Union that just over half a century earlier had been applied to the native population of North America. In the early 1940s, the Soviet Union lost 27 million more lives defending itself against Nazism. Without the Red Army, the Third Reich would never have been defeated. After the end of the war, in the spring of 1945, Germany was divided between East and West. The eastern half was controlled by Soviet military bases, while the West was quickly rebuilt with investments from the United States and Switzerland. In 1947, Germany's own currency, the Deutschmark, was reinstated in Western Germany, backed by offshore Western capital. It looked like the West was going to rebuild and re-empower Germany yet again, just like they had in the early 30s. In 1949, the powers of Western Europe and the United States created an alliance of mutual military support called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO for short. Throughout the 40 years of Cold War that ensued, a term coined by the Nobel Prize-winning wordsmith Winston Churchill, the same person that coined the term the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union would be accused constantly of planning to invade the West any minute now. What do you think? Can a country that covers an enormous territory, that had just survived a totally devastating invasion of its most populated area by the greatest army in the world at the cost of tens of millions of lives, a country that had been cut out of the global markets or business relations of the West, can a country like that plan to invade anything? Or maybe by protecting the Soviet bloc, like the much trumpeted episode with the tanks in Prague in 1968, for example. Maybe the Soviet Union was trying to protect itself from being attacked again. By 1956, Western Germany was allowed by the international community to build up its military yet again. Let's fast forward through the entire Cold War to 1989, the year that the democratic and liberal Soviet president Mikhail Gorbachev tore down the Berlin Wall. In the negotiations with the United States and with the heads of NATO, Gorbachev claims to have been assured that NATO military would not spread, quote, an inch to the east. And yet, spread to the east is the first thing NATO forces did. After that, after Gorbachev's at best irresponsible experiments led to the annihilation of the Soviet Union, NATO has shown up with guns ablazing farther and farther east every few years. The mechanism is simple. In any country with a ruling regime that's not hostile to Russia, a civil war suddenly breaks out, usually on the grounds of ethnic conflict between peoples that had lived together peacefully for decades previously. Western media immediately get behind the toppling of the current regime. NATO peacekeepers step in to keep peace, like they did in the 90s in Yugoslavia, for example. Remember Yugoslav President Slobodan Milosevic, the face of evil? The court that once convicted him of war crimes reversed its conviction last week. Unfortunately, Milosevic is too dead to enjoy his exoneration. Today, NATO military spending accounts for 70% of the military spending in the world. Each member country is expected to contribute 2% of its GDP to NATO buildup. By the way, Albania and Croatia, two of the 6 pieces into which NATO helped Yugoslavia break in its so-called fight for freedom, joined NATO in 2009, bringing the number of member states obligated to participate in all military activity together to 28. Back in the 90s, after the breakup of Yugoslavia, there was an initiative by France to make NATO military action subject to UN approval. This was overturned by the US and the United Kingdom, on the grounds that Russia has veto power in the United Nations. As Vladimir Putin has said, quote, "We attempt time and time again to engage the NATO powers in a dialogue. We ask what their missiles are doing surrounding our borders. Time and time again, we are told, that's none of your business, don't worry about it." End quote. We'll talk about the events that have unfolded in Ukraine over the last couple of years next time on Understand Russia.